Hi, this is Genevieve from the GATK team. In this video, I'll show you how to troubleshoot errors with GATK-SV. GATK-SV is a pipeline available in Terra to find structural variants in whole genome sequencing data. You can find articles describing an overview of the method and how to get started in the video description. In this video, we will be going through a troubleshooting example to show how to fix an out-of-memory or out-of-disk error. We will first identify the issue in the job manager and look through the information about the failed task. Then, we will determine the cause of the failure and the attribute we need to change to fix the issue. The final step will be to edit the workflow and resubmit. We'll start by going to the job manager. The job manager is within the Job History tab with the workspace, so click on the Job History tab. The Job History tab lists all your submissions of this workflow. You can see which submissions were successful and which ones crashed in the status column. To get to the job manager, click on the submission name that you will be troubleshooting. Let's click on this one with the error in the submissions column. Now on the right side of the submission table, you will see a column titled Links, where there is a checkbox icon that will take you to the job manager for this submission. Click on the Job Manager link. Here in the Job Manager, we can get a detailed look at the submission details. When your job did not succeed, you'll see an Errors tab like this. But if your job did succeed, there will be an Outputs tab instead of an Errors tab. Here, the Errors tab shows the name of the failed task and the failure message. Terra pulls out this failure message from the metadata as a probable cause of the failure. Sometimes this message indicates the cause of the failure, but sometimes you'll need to look further into the logs to determine the true issue. Next, we're going to go into more detail while troubleshooting an example workflow failure. So starting here in the Job Manager for the Gather Sample Evidence workflow, in the Errors tab, we can see that the failed task is WAMG, and the failure message says that the standard error file contains one of the memory retry error keys. To interpret the error message, we can look at the GATK-SV troubleshooting document on the GATK site, which contains explanations for common error messages. Though in this example, the error message means that the task ran out of memory. Sometimes the error message isn't as specific as this one. In those cases, we need to go into the log files for the task and look for the cause. To see the log files, click on the task name and then click on the Page in Cloud icon. Since this task ran out of memory, we then need to find the correct input to change so that WAMG will have enough memory when we retry. The memory and disk space for every task in the GATK-SV pipeline are controlled by a runtime attributes struct that holds the memory, disk space, and other attributes we won't need to worry about today. If we want to increase the memory or disk in a particular task, we can override these attributes in Terra with arguments that are specific for each task. To find this argument, I'm going to keep multiple open tabs, starting with the Job Manager and the GATK-SV GitHub page to browse GATK-SV whittles. This GitHub tab will be able to use to find the runtime attributes argument for our failed task. So now in Terra, the list view of the Job Manager, we can see all the tasks and sub-workflows in the Gather Sample Evidence workflow. You can identify sub-workflows or scattered tasks because they will be underlined to show that they link to the tasks or sub-workflows nested inside. So here in the Job Manager for Gather Sample Evidence top-level workflow, the failure occurred in the WAMG sub-workflow. Following along in the GitHub repo, let's open tabs for both the Gather Sample Evidence whittle and the WAMG whittle. We'll come back to these tabs in a moment. And then back in Terra, we'll click on the WAMG sub-workflow and see that the failure occurred in the Run WAMG Include List task. Run WAMG Include List is not a link, So we know that we're at the bottom level task, and this is the actual source of the failure. Here at the failed task, there's another link to the log files for the task if you need to see them. So here in the links, click on the Notepad and Cloud icon. And then here we're going to look at the compute details in the links. So in the information icon with a lowercase I, it leads to a pop-up. And then in the compute details, we can see how much memory the task ran with. We usually recommend checking here because the actual memory can be different from the inputs if memory retry is enabled. So click to expand the metadata and then go to the pipeline and then to environment. This will give you the mem size and mem unit. If you also want to see the disk, it's in resources under pipeline and then go to the disk. We can see here, looking at the mem size, it was 4.9 gigs. And since we've gotten out of memory error after submitting the job with 4.9 gigs, we should resubmit the job with double the memory. We can increase the memory with the runtime attributes argument, which controls the resource allocation for WAMG. And so go to the GitHub tabs showing the code for the workflow, and the name that we're looking for the failed task is run WAMG include list. In the WAMG WDL, navigate to that task. In this task, we're looking for the name of the runtime atcher override input. So here we can see that the attribute is called runtime atcher include list. So because WAMG is a sub workflow, we need to then determine if the name on the attribute is consistent in the top level workflow. So we'll go up a level to the tab that we already have open, gather sample evidence, and we're looking in this WDL for when it calls the WAMG sub workflow and if the runtime atcher include list is controlled by a certain input. So here we'll see the WAMG sub workflow being called, and the runtime atcher include list is named runtime atcher WAM include list. So the attribute will change in the gather sample evidence workflow to give WAMG more memory is called runtime atcher WAM include list. Now we'll edit the workflow input to increase the memory and rerun the failed workflow. In gather sample evidence, the runtime atcher WAM include list argument is an optional input. So we need to navigate to the bottom of the page to find the optional inputs. Runtime atcher WAM include list is a struct, so it gets curly braces, and we only have to enter the attribute in the struct that we want to change. We don't need to enter all the other attributes. We are just changing the memory, so enter memgb in quotes with a colon, then 10 for 10 gigs. If you need to change another attribute, enter a comma after the 10 to enter the next attribute. Like for example, you could change the disk GB as well. So now, like this, we're ready to resubmit the workflow. So go and click Save to save the changes to the inputs. And then select just the failed sample or samples. And then we are going to resubmit. We do recommend making a note of the changed input in the notes section of the submission, and then remember to delete the memory increase input the next time you run a new sample. Going over this process one final time, we have shown here how to find the error message for a failed workflow, then find the information about the failed task in the job manager, determine the workflow input that needs to be changed, and then change the runtime attribute input in the workflow submission. This is a complicated process, so thank you for watching, and please post any questions that you have in the GATK forum, and a member of the GATK team will be happy to help.